Kanji is often thought to be one of the most, if not the most difficult things in all of the Japanese language. But before you start learning it, it can be helpful to figure out what it is and how to use it. And let's figure that out now. So kanji is taken directly from the Chinese writing system. A lot of these characters are exactly the same. Some of them are slightly modified, and I'm sure some of them are completely new, but they do come from Chinese. In Chinese, there's many more kanji than there are in the Japanese language. The reason being that Japanese also has hiragana and katakana to switch between for different parts of the language, but Chinese only has kanji. So the good news is that you don't have to learn quite as many characters, Chinese characters, kanji, when learning Japanese, but there are definitely still thousands of them. Which of course is very different from hiragana and katakana, because with hiragana and katakana, it's reasonable to set out with the goal of, I want to learn all of hiragana, and then do it in maybe a couple weeks or so. You could do the same thing with katakana, but because there are thousands of kanji, it's just not really reasonable to set out with the goal of learning all of them in a short amount of time. What ends up being the case is it's much better to take it slow and pick up kanji over time as you need them, as you're learning words. After you learn the words, then you learn the kanji that is associated with the word that you just learned. Now, kanji is also different from hiragana and katakana because kanji uses a picture to show a meaning. Hiragana and katakana was a character that represents a sound, but kanji doesn't represent a sound. Kanji represents a meaning. We have an example of that here. So this is the word denwa, which means phone. Den means electricity, and this wa part means talking. So we have electric talking, which comes together to mean phone. And that's kind of how kanji functions. The main purpose of this kanji is to represent electricity. It is pronounced den, but that's kind of a side part of it. The main part is for the meaning. And that's what we're going to be using to be making words. Sometimes it's just one character, but sometimes we're combining Chinese characters in order to make words. Here's another example here. We have kanji. This is how you write kanji in kanji. The kan part means China, essentially, and the ji means character. And we can see that kanji does end up being quite a bit more complicated than hiragana as far as number of strokes involved. Some of these have well over 10 strokes, and of course hiragana usually around 2, 3, 4. So kanji does end up being a lot more difficult in that way as well. There are more simple kanji characters, like this one here, which is chikara, that means power. So it's not that there are not simple kanji, it's that the majority of them are at least more complicated than hiragana and katakana. The thing about kanji is that it is oftentimes the best way to write a word. Anytime you're learning a new word, it probably has a kanji, and the kanji is probably the best way of writing it. That's not the case for every word, but oftentimes the case for words. Kanji is also cool because you can sometimes differentiate the meanings of words using the kanji. I have an example using hair, paper, and god here. There's also hayai and hayai. Hayai can mean either fast or early, and there's two different kanji that shows which one you mean, which wouldn't show up in speaking, of course, but in speaking it would be quite clear through context alone. One more difficult thing about kanji, as if it wasn't difficult enough already. Not only are there thousands of them, but kanji usually has multiple pronunciations depending on the kanji itself. I've heard from Chinese speakers that in Chinese, each character only has one pronunciation, and so you learn the kanji and then you know that pronunciation, and anytime you see it, it's going to be the same. That's not the case in Japanese. Here's a good example right here. This is the kanji hi, which means day or sun. And when it's on its own, it will be pronounced hi. But you might know it in the word Nihon, which means Japan. And so our pronunciation changed from hi to to ni. But then if we flip those kanji, we now have the word honjitsu, which is a completely different pronunciation entirely again. Now it changed to jitsu. So depending on the word, these kanji might have different pronunciations. And some people do set out and learn each kanji and learn the different pronunciations for each kanji. The way that I usually suggest that people do it is learn the words, and then you can learn the pronunciations of the kanji in the words. By learning the word nihon, you can learn that one of the pronunciations of this kanji is ni, for example. That's the way that I did it, but of course, it's not necessarily the best, just kind of the way that I did it, and therefore the way that I suggest people do it as well. Just because vocabulary is very useful, and you might as well learn vocabulary in a way that you can use it instead of just learning all of these pronunciations that don't mean anything unless there's vocabulary with them. I like to mention as well that different words have a best way of being written. I mentioned before that kanji is oftentimes the best way to write a word, but that doesn't mean it's always the best way of writing a word. And here's a fun example, using the word kirei, which means beautiful. I found this on a site a while ago. It seemed at least fairly trustworthy, of a website that you could put in a word and it would search through a huge database of words and see what percentage of the time that word was written in what way. And it found that the word kirei 52% of the time is written in hiragana, and only 32% of the time is it written in kanji. And if we make this nice and big here for a second, we can kind of see why. This kanji is incredibly difficult. There's many strokes, and so it's so much more difficult to write this word in kanji than it is in hiragana that people just kind of ended up writing it more often in hiragana. And that does sometimes happen, that we'll have words that have kanji, but they're more commonly written in hiragana. And not very often written in katakana, but sometimes. And sometimes they have different feels as well, to what they feel like if you write it in a certain way. In this example, I would say that kirei, if you write it in kanji, it feels fancier, but if you write it in hiragana, that's again just kind of the standard. So to wrap up everything, if you just watch the videos about hiragana, katakana, and kanji, again, it is definitely most important to learn hiragana first. Before you do anything else, learn hiragana. Then you can start learning katakana if you want to. I do suggest going to vocabulary first before you get into katakana. And for kanji, again, the way that I suggest learning it is after you've learned a word. Maybe you learn that Nihon means Japan. Now your next step is to learn the kanji that's associated with the word Nihon. Of course, it takes a very long time because there's thousands of them, but with lots of practicing and studying, you'll definitely get there.